There is a building in Chartres, France, that has stood for nearly 900 years. Most people who visit it walk through its doors, look up at the soaring stone vaults, and feel something. Something they cannot name, something that moves in the chest or settles in the spine. They attribute it to faith, to beauty, to the grandeur of the architecture. They take their photographs, they light a candle, and then they leave. But what if that feeling was not spiritual at all? What if it was biological? What if those walls, those proportions, those windows, that stone, were never designed to house God, but to heal the body? What if the cathedral was not a temple, but a technology? And what if someone, at some point in history, figured that out and turned it off? The great Gothic cathedrals of Europe were built across a period of roughly 300 years, beginning in the mid-12th century and extending into the 15th. Notre Dame de Paris, Chartres, Cologne, Salisbury, Canterbury, Reims, Amiens, Santiago de Compostela, each one a monument of staggering ambition, requiring generations of labor, enormous sums of money, and levels of architectural precision that would challenge engineers today. The official story is familiar. These buildings were houses of Christian worship, constructed to the glory of God and the power of the Church. They were funded by bishops, guided by master builders, and raised stone by stone over decades and sometimes centuries. Their height was meant to inspire humility. Their light, filtered through colored glass, was meant to evoke the divine. Their music was meant to carry prayer upward into heaven. This is what we are taught. This is what the guidebooks say. This is the story that has been told, in some form, for 700 years. But there is another story. Quieter, older, buried in the technical dimensions of the buildings themselves. In the accounts of medieval pilgrims who arrived sick and left healed. In the writings of scholars who noticed patterns that the official narrative never tried to explain. In the precise mathematical relationships encoded in the stone, relationships that have nothing to do with theology and everything to do with physics. The question this documentary asks is simple. Were Gothic cathedrals built primarily as churches? Or were they built as something far more extraordinary? And if they were something else, something more, what happened to that knowledge? The historical record is largely consistent on how these buildings came to exist. The Gothic style emerged around 1140 at the Royal Abbey of Saint-Denis, near Paris, under the direction of Abbot Suger. Suger was a theologian, a statesman, and a man obsessed with light. He believed that physical beauty could elevate the human soul toward God. His innovations, the pointed arch, the ribbed vault, the flying buttress, were not merely structural experiments. They were theological statements. They allowed walls to be thinner, windows to be larger, and buildings to be taller than anything that had come before. Within decades, the Gothic model had spread across France, England, and Germany with remarkable speed. Bishops competed to build higher, larger, and more luminous structures. The Cathedral of Notre Dame de Chartres, rebuilt after a fire in 1194, was constructed in a single campaign lasting less than 30 years, an almost unthinkable achievement for the time. Thousands of workers, many of them volunteers drawn from across the region, participated in its construction. Pilgrims came to these cathedrals in enormous numbers. The pilgrimage routes of medieval Europe converged on great churches that housed holy relics, fragments of saints, pieces of the cross, bones attributed to figures from Scripture. Pilgrims traveled hundreds of miles on foot, often ill, often desperate, seeking miraculous cures at the shrines within. And many, according to the records, received exactly that. The healing was attributed to the saints, to prayer, to divine mercy. That is the accepted account. Clean, coherent, and consistent with everything the medieval church taught. It explains why the buildings were built. It explains why people came. And it explains the healings as a product of faith. Case closed, as far as the history books are concerned. But the healings did not happen everywhere. They happened in specific places inside the cathedrals. And the earliest records that predate the systematic theology of pilgrimage, describe those places with unusual precision. In 1901, a French researcher named René Merlet published a detailed analysis of the crypt beneath Chartres Cathedral. What he found, buried in documents that had not been widely circulated since the 17th century, was evidence that the site of the cathedral had been used as a place of healing long before Christianity arrived in France. The Druids, according to several early medieval sources, had maintained a sacred site at Chartres. Beneath the current cathedral, carved into the living rock of the crypt, archaeologists have confirmed the existence of a pre-Christian well, a well that was still drawing pilgrims for its healing properties as late as the 12th century, centuries after the site had been Christianized. This alone might mean very little. Sacred sites were frequently built over older sacred sites. The church often adopted pre-existing places of power. That was deliberate policy. But here is where things become more interesting. Researchers in the 1970s, using instruments unavailable to earlier generations, began measuring the electromagnetic and acoustic properties of Gothic cathedrals with scientific precision. What they discovered was not what they had expected. The buildings were not simply large, resonant spaces. They were extraordinarily precisely tuned environments. The dimensions of Chartres Cathedral, when analyzed acoustically, produce standing wave patterns at frequencies that correspond to what researchers have since identified as the range most associated with altered states of consciousness in human neurology. Frequencies between roughly 4 and 8 Hz, in the range scientists call theta waves. These are the frequencies the human brain enters during deep meditation, during certain stages of sleep, during states that healers across many traditions associate with recovery, integration, and repair. This was not a coincidence that the measurements produced. It was an effect that required precise engineering to achieve. The acoustic properties of Chartres are not unique. Dr. Yegor Reznikov, a specialist in prehistoric acoustics at the University of Paris, spent decades studying the acoustic design of ancient sacred spaces. His published work, beginning in the 1980s, demonstrated that the most decorated locations in Paleolithic caves, locations covered with paintings of animals and human figures, locations used for tens of thousands of years, were consistently the locations with the most remarkable acoustic resonance. Not the widest spaces, not the brightest locations, the places where sound behaved in the most unusual and affecting ways. When Reznikov extended his methodology to Gothic cathedrals, the pattern held and intensified. The cathedrals were not simply resonant. They were resonant in ways that required the builders to have understood, at some level, in some form, the relationship between specific frequencies and specific human physiological responses. He was careful in his language. He did not claim the medieval builders had oscilloscopes, but he was clear that the acoustic tuning was too precise, too consistent, across too many buildings in too many countries, to be the product of chance. Then there is the question of the stone itself. Chartres Cathedral is built almost entirely from a particular limestone quarried nearby, in the region of Chartres. This stone has an unusually high silica content. Silica, in certain forms, is piezoelectric, meaning it generates electrical charge when subjected to mechanical stress, including the stress produced by sound waves. A group of researchers, writing in the Journal of the Acoustical Society of America in the late 1990s, noted that the combination of highly resonant acoustics and piezoelectric stone in Gothic cathedrals would, under the right conditions, produce measurable electromagnetic field effects inside the structures. The stone, in other words, would not merely carry sound. It would, in response to sound, generate subtle electrical fields. Fields whose intensity and frequency would vary depending on the acoustics of the space. Fields that would, in principle, affect the electrical environment of biological tissue. And now return to the pilgrims. To the sick arriving at cathedral doors. To the recorded healings. They were not simply sitting in a pretty room and praying. Many of them, according to the accounts, would sleep in the cathedral for days. This practice had a name. It was called incubation, from the Latin, meaning to lie upon. It was a healing practice borrowed, entirely intact, from the ancient Greek temples of Asclepius, the god of medicine. Greek patients seeking healing would sleep inside the temple, lying on the ground, until they experienced healing dreams or physical recovery. The medieval church absorbed this practice without apparent examination of its mechanism. It called it vigil. It reframed it as an act of devotion. But the structure of what was happening, a sick person lying in a precisely tuned resonant environment for extended periods in a state between waking and sleep, remained identical to what had been happening in healing temples for 1,000 years before the first cathedral was built. Is it possible that the builders of the Gothic cathedrals possessed a body of knowledge, a practical understanding of bioacoustics, of resonant frequency, of the relationship between architectural space and human physiology that has since been entirely lost? Not as a theoretical framework, not written in any surviving text, but as a craft tradition, passed through guilds, embedded in the dimensions and proportions of the buildings themselves, the way a recipe is embedded in the practice of a cook who cannot read? The guild records of medieval stonemasons are remarkable for what they contain and for what they conceal. The master builders who constructed the great cathedrals, men known by names like Jean de Chelles and Robert de Luzarches, left almost no written accounts of their methods. What has survived are the notebooks of Villard de Honnecourt, a 13th-century French architect whose sketchbook, preserved in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, records geometric systems of extraordinary precision. Systems for generating the proportions of arches, vaults, and window tracery. Systems that, when analyzed by modern geometers, embed mathematical relationships including the golden ratio and specific harmonic proportions, whose acoustic consequences would have been well understood by anyone who had worked with them long enough to hear their effects. The knowledge did not need to be written down. It was built into the rules, into the apprenticeship, into the proportions that a master builder told his apprentice to use without necessarily explaining why. Or, and this is the second possibility, harder to dismiss but also harder to verify, the knowledge was deliberate, conscious, and protected. There is a long tradition in the historical scholarship of medieval architecture of what might be called sacred geometry, a system of mathematical proportions believed to encode divine principles into physical form. This tradition is usually treated as theological metaphor. But what if it was also, simultaneously, practical technology? What if the sacred proportions were sacred precisely because someone had discovered that they worked, that they produced environments in which human beings healed faster, felt more profoundly at peace, experienced altered states of consciousness that facilitated recovery? There is a date that appears in this story with uncomfortable frequency: the year 1307. In October of that year, the Knights Templar, the military order that had for nearly 2 centuries served as the primary bankers of the great cathedral building projects across Europe, were arrested across France in a single coordinated dawn raid ordered by King Philip IV. Their leaders were tortured, their records seized, and their order was formally dissolved by papal decree in 1312. Whatever they knew, whatever libraries they had accumulated during their decades in Jerusalem and the Levant, vanished with them. The Templars had financed the construction of dozens of cathedrals. They had maintained close relationships with the guilds of master builders. And according to several later medieval sources that were not written by the Templars themselves, but by historians who had access to documents no longer available, the Templars possessed architectural knowledge of non-European origin, acquired during their time in the Middle East, where they had access to traditions of sacred building that predated Christianity by thousands of years. Following 1307, the great cathedral building era effectively ended. The last of the major Gothic cathedrals were completed using designs already established. No significant new structural innovations appeared. And the practice of incubation, of sleeping in the cathedral for healing, began a slow decline that accelerated through the 14th and 15th centuries, until it was formally discouraged and eventually prohibited by church authorities as incompatible with proper Christian devotion. By the 16th century, the cathedrals had been fully reframed. They were houses of worship, places of sermon, of sacrament, of communal gathering. The acoustic and electromagnetic dimensions of the buildings had not changed. The stone still resonated. The frequencies were still there, but the practice of using them, the specific practice of lying in the resonant space over extended periods in a theta state with intention toward healing, had been removed. You cannot turn off a building, but you can turn off the knowledge of how to use it. 900 years after the builders of Chartres set their final stone, the building still hums. On a quiet day, in a low register, visitors sometimes report feeling it more than hearing it. Something below the threshold of ordinary sound. Something that moves through the body rather than past it. The official explanation is that this is the effect of the wind, interacting with the architecture. It may be exactly that. Or it may be that we are standing inside a machine we no longer know how to operate. A machine whose builders encoded their knowledge into the dimensions of the stone rather than the pages of a book, precisely because they understood that books can be burned and dimensions cannot. We will likely never know with certainty what the master builders of the 12th and 13th centuries understood or what they intended. The records are gone. The guilds are gone. The tradition, if it existed in the form suggested by the measurements and the patterns and the strange persistence of the healings, was broken before anyone thought to write it down in a language we could still read. But consider this. In the centuries since researchers began measuring the acoustic and electromagnetic properties of Gothic cathedrals, not one study has fully explained why those properties are as precise as they are. Not one mainstream architectural historian has offered a satisfactory account of why the builders consistently chose dimensions that happened to produce the exact frequencies associated with human neurological recovery. Not one explanation has accounted for why the healing tradition that took place inside these buildings was functionally identical to the healing traditions of ancient Greece, ancient Egypt, and ancient Mesopotamia. Traditions that the medieval church officially rejected. Maybe it was architecture and nothing more. Maybe the proportions were chosen for beauty, and the acoustics were a fortunate accident, and the healings were the product of faith and suggestion, and the extraordinary resilience of the human body given rest and stillness. Maybe the pilgrims who walked 500 miles and lay down on cold stone floors and rose 3 days later with their fevers broken were simply lucky. Or maybe they understood something about those buildings that we have spent 7 centuries forgetting. Maybe the people who built those spaces knew exactly what they were building, and the people who came to lie inside them knew exactly what they were doing. And maybe the most remarkable thing about those structures is not that they were raised at all, but that they are still standing.